Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. Today I'm excited to be comparing two of my favourite synths. So here on my left I have the Mask1 by Kodamo. Here on my right I have the Prologue 16 by Korg. These are two of my favourite synths. As I say, I normally have them in different places in my studio, so it's not often that I have them together in a position where I can compare them. It just so happens that they've been put in this place today, and as they're here I thought, why not do a comparison video just exploring the different sound of these two synths. So I am going to try and focus in this video exclusively, as much as I can, just talking about the sound and maybe the sound design experience of these synths. I'm not going to talk about the price of the synths. I'm not going to talk about the build quality, the MIDI implementation, the multi-timbrality, or any of that. I'm just going to try and focus on the sound as much as I can. Otherwise, I'd be here for hours talking about these synths because as I say, they're two of my favorite synths, and I feel like I know them pretty well by this point. So I have done a previous video just looking at the sounds of these two synths. I just compared some patches one against the other. I'll put a link to that video. It's a short video with no talking, so that's a bit of background. If you're interested in the aspects of these synths other than the raw sound comparison that I'm going to carry out, then I've done plenty of videos on both the Prologue and the Mask1 on my channel. Feel free to watch those if you're interested and want to find out more. I suspect probably more people who are watching this video know about the Korg Prologue than about the Mask1. Again, if I wanted to start talking about the pros and cons of each, I could be here for hours, so I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to try and do as much as I can a head-to-head comparison between these two synths. What I think I'm going to do is do two patches. I'm going to do one patch where I'm going to start with the Prologue and try and see how far I can replicate the sound of the Prologue on the Mask1, and hopefully that will show some interesting differences. And then for the second exercise, I'm going to do the reverse. I'm going to start with the Mask1, come up with a patch and see how far I can track that on the Prologue. So that's the structure of the video. Let's get started. So to explain, I've just got the audio outs of both the Prologue and the Mask1 going into my mixer. I've tried to match the levels. I've got an init patch for both synths, which is just a single sawtooth oscillator. So let's just hear that. So here is the Prologue. Hopefully you can see that on the oscilloscope. And here is the Mask1. So I'll play them one after the other. So there's the Prologue, then the Mask1. So there's no, I've not done any modulation or filtering or any effects on either of those synths. So just from that raw tone, I think you can hear that there's a lot more high frequency information in the Mask1 sawtooth than in the Prologue. Let's do that again. So I'll start with the Mask1 this time and then do the Prologue. The Prologue sounds slightly muffled to me, almost as if the filter isn't fully open. It is fully open. That's as far as it will go, but you are definitely noticing a lack of some high frequency content compared to the Mask1, where of course the filter is fully open here as well. And another interesting thing I noticed just looking at the oscilloscope is that the Mask1 sawtooth wave shape is a kind of up ramp, whereas the Prologue is a down ramp, as it is shown on the front panel actually. If you play them together, you get that kind of phasing, almost like pulse width modulation. That's interesting. Okay, so as I say, we're going to start with a Prologue patch. So we just got one oscillator. Let's add some release. It's very simple. Obviously, the Prologue has VCOs. The Mask1 has kind of bit masking oscillators, which you could say in some ways sound a bit like a kind of virtual analog approach, at least on some of the bit masks. So I'm just going to increase the release on the Mask1 and we'll see. So it's even more noticeable there when you're playing a chord how much the Prologue sound is filtered by default. I don't know if this is just my unit or if they're all like that. I wouldn't be surprised. I also had a subsequent 37 in the past, and that notoriously the filter did not open all the way, which gave it its kind of famously muffled sound. So there we are. Sounds like we're always getting some kind of filtering in there in the Prologue compared to the Mask1. Let's introduce a second oscillator. Now obviously, as these are VCOs, they're never going to be wholly in tune with each other, and so you get that kind of lovely movement from analog synths. So let's try that. And likewise, we can do the same on the Mask1. So now, an interesting thing about the Mask1, I've mentioned this a lot of times, is that even though it's completely digital synths, these aren't VCOs, the way that the bit masking synthesis seems to operate, there is an inherent pitch instability in each of the oscillators. So, as I say, even though it's a digital synth, I'm not introducing any deliberate detune or any slop or anything like that. They just inherently are unstable, and so you do get that kind of analog phasing. So far, I'd say they sound pretty similar, apart from the fact that obviously the Mask1, you've got more high frequency information. The other thing I would mention is that just listening to the Mask1 bit mask oscillator, they don't sound as smooth as the Prologue VCOs. There's a kind of glitch or, a kind of a digital edge to them, I'd say, which is noticeable when you compare them to the VCOs. I don't know if that's just the filtering that you're hearing on the Prologue that is taking out that kind of tone, but it's definitely noticeable. Now, the other thing I'd mention is just comparing, this 2 oscillator patch on the Prologue. Hopefully you can hear it as well as see it on the oscilloscope. You do get a bit of movement. I've not detuned either of these oscillators against each other so far, but it's relatively subtle, whereas on the Mask1, if anything, the phasing is more extreme, which I find quite interesting, that there is more instability or less perfection, you could say, in the oscillators on the digital Mask1 than in the VCOs and the Prologue. That's not to say that the Prologue VCOs sound sterile or anything like that. I think they sound really nice, and you can always detune them. And there's another trick that I will get into in a bit when we're patching. So the next thing, obviously, that we have these 2 VCOs. Let's just adjust the filter. Add a bit of filter envelope. Okay, so let's do something similar. Now, I said I wasn't going to try and focus purely on the sound and not talk too much, but I have to just point out the Prologue has a 12 dB per octave, two-pole filter, low-pass filter. It does have this low-cut filter as well, which is at a fixed frequency. The filtering in the Mask1 by default is also a low-pass 12 dB per octave filter. So let's just do that. Reduce the cutoff. Yeah, the filter in the Prologue is a VCF, voltage control filter, so it's analog obviously. Digital filter in the Mask1. I still think the Mask1 filter sounds very nice though, so let's add some envelope. Interesting, I'm noticing the envelope shapes seem to be a bit different. Yeah, so here we have the Prologue. Here we have the Mask1. So just on that example, I would say the Prologue does sound more analog. I think that's partly to do with the fact that even though these envelopes on the Prologue, they are digital. I mean, it's marketed as an analog flagship synth, but apart from the VCOs and the filter, and also this low frequency compressor, which is just off the camera, so you can't quite see it, but on the Prologue 16 you have this low frequency compressor. I think all of those elements are obviously analog, but everything else on the synth is digital, so all the LFOs, the envelopes, the effects obviously, etc, etc. But so that is the sound of the Prologue filter. That's the Prologue. That's the Mask1. Interesting. So it's quite subtle, and I think if you just play them separately, you wouldn't necessarily know which was which, but comparing them like that, I think I do prefer the filtered sawtooth waves on the Prologue compared to the Mask1. Which is interesting because I do often use it as a kind of virtual analog synth, but just comparing them here, I can see that there is something to the Prologue VCOs and filter that it's got a little bit of extra there. Now the next thing I wanted to show is this trick that you've got on the Prologue. Well, I call it a trick, it's just a feature, which is cross modulation between the two waveforms. So let's just hear how that sounds. So you can increase it to make it sound quite extreme. But when you just introduce a little bit, it does give a lot of, just a bit of movement to the oscillators, which is great. Now, here's where the Prologue, funnily enough, leaves the Mask1 behind, because at the moment there's no way to cross-modulate or do any kind of modulation at all between the oscillators, which I guess was a design choice by Kodamo, but it means that you're not going to be able to get that kind of movement. What I can try to do is detune the oscillators against each other and see if we can get in the same ballpark. So I'll try that. I'll just detune one against the other. It's close, I'd say, but it's not quite the same effect. That's the Mask1. This is the Prologue. It's pretty similar. This is the Mask1. The Prologue again. We're getting there. Okay, so the next thing I'll explore is the resonance on the filter. So I've turned the resonance up to halfway. Turn it down a bit. Just play with the resonance for a bit. Yeah, I think the resonance sounds really nice on the Prologue filter. So let's try the equivalent on the Mask1. Just going to tweak the envelopes a bit. It's the Prologue. It's the Mask1. Back to the Prologue. Back to the Prologue. Back to the Mask1. Back to the Prologue. Okay, to me it definitely sounds like the Mask1 filter with the resonance sounds more digital compared to the Prologue filter, but I wouldn't say I necessarily prefer one to the other. I can see how in different cases you might prefer one to the other. Yeah, okay, now I guess the next thing to do is just bring in a bit of noise, because both the Prologue and the Mask1 have a third sound source as well as the two kind of pitched oscillators. On the Prologue you have this versatile multi-engine, which as well as this is a straightforward digital engine, so as well as the noise you've got VPM, which is Korg's version of FM, and you've got the user oscillators, which are oscillators that users of the synth can program and you can load into the synth, of which I've got a few. I'm not going to look at them in this video because that will make it too long. On the Mask1, you've just got a straightforward noise source for the third option. So let's add some noise to the sound. So you've got various options for noise. I'm not going to go through them all. By default, you start on this option, which says high here on the screen. And that means that the shape knob you've got here acts as a high pass filter. Which is great. That's really useful. You've got other options. Obviously, you've got low pass, peak, decimator. Great. You've also got more flexibility in the Prologue. I mean, again, it's characterized as a very basic synthesizer, and in some ways it is. And I'm going to try not to talk too much about the synth apart from the sound design, but this brings up the fact that on the Prologue, I can choose whether the noise comes in before or after the filter. So again, you've got a separate filter option on the noise, and you can have the filter doing different things to the VCOs from the noise option. So that is a great option that you have on the Prologue. Unfortunately, at the moment, you don't have that option on the Mask1. All three of the sound sources, both oscillators and the noise, go through the filter at the moment. But let's, and also there's no specific filter built into the noise sound source. But let's just add some noise to the sound. I think the noise on the Mask1 sounds great as well. Obviously, you don't have a specific filter for it. Let's match it to the... that's something else I should say, actually. I haven't mentioned that as I've been patching, but one of the simplicities of the Prologue is that you only have one amplitude envelope for all the sound sources. On the Mask1, you have separate amplitude envelopes for each of the three sound sources and the filter, which means it is a bit more complicated patching on the Mask1 because I've got to think about the envelope for each of these sources, which I don't for the Prologue. But I'm just going to match the envelopes, so that should get us to the same place. Okay, so that is probably as far as I'm going to take it, because we've got a kind of standard virtual analog patch on the Mask1, obviously, whereas it's properly analog on the Prologue. Let me know in the comments which you prefer out of those two sounds. I'm now going to move on to the second part of the video, where I'm going to start with patching on the Mask1 and then try and see what I can do to match it on the Prologue. So that's the second part of the video, which is coming up now. Okay, so I've initialized the patches again. So we're back to Sawtooth on the Mask1 and the Prologue, and again you can hear the differences immediately in the kind of different tones. So let's start with making a patch on the Mask1. Now, I was trying to focus as much as I can on the sound of these two synths, but inevitably you're going to have to talk about the user interface, because with the Prologue, as soon as you start patching, you look at the knobs, for example, and you have the big filter cutoff knob there, so it's immediately obvious, what Korg is trying to tell you should be the focus of your sound design. And then, the user interface guides you to working in a particular way with that synth. And it's the same for the Mask1. You have these rows of menu options essentially, but there's no big filter knob. There's only two knobs, one for volume and one which is a value encoder, which has so one has a kind of very basic purpose and the other has a kind of variable purpose. So what do you do? So the essence of the Mask1, I suppose, is the bit masks. So if we go to the bit mask menu, which is the kind of default, the first menu option when you push one of the oscillator buttons, and then you scroll through the bit masks, then that kind of, you start to get a sense of what this synth is about. So you have all these different wave shapes essentially, but what's noticeable on the Mask1 is there's no way of blending between the different wave shapes. On the Prologue, there are these options for the VCOs, which I don't tend to use that much, but these are wave shape options, and let's just try that on the Sawtooth and see what effect it has. So let's look at the differences between the two approaches. Here you have continuously variable wave shape within a relatively narrow range, I would say. Whereas on the Mask1 you have discontinuous different wave shapes, but there's a massive range of different shapes. So there's actually 512 different bit mask shapes. So this is one of my favorite bit mask shapes. So let's start with this. So this is, as you can see from the number, bit mask 15. So this is a half sine. Now there's no direct equivalent to the half sine on the Prologue. So almost immediately you're in a different world basically once you start trying to use the strengths of, or the unique features of the Mask1. There's no parallel really to that in the Prologue as a default. If you go into the user waves, I'm sure there are some custom oscillators which can get you, I don't know if there's a specific user oscillator which has got a half sine shape, but that would be where you would go to that to try and find that kind of thing. So I'm not going to get into that because it's not really fair. Everyone's Prologue will have a different collection of user oscillators that they've uploaded into it, whereas the Mask1, it's all what comes out of the factory is what you've got in terms of the kind of raw synthesis capabilities, the raw waveforms, and that's immediately just a sound that you can't really get on the Prologue. I mean, I wonder whether the closest thing would be a triangle. So I changed the VCO shape on the Prologue to a triangle. Similar, but not quite there. But let's go with that because it's never going to be a straight shootout because each of these synths does things that the other synth doesn't. So let's start with the half sine, and we'll try and use the triangle on the Prologue to be an equivalent of that. So I'll put both oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 on half sine, and let's make a kind of pad sound. So I've had a bit of release, add a bit of attack. So immediately that sound is taking me somewhere. Can I get anywhere near that on the Prologue? Let's see. So you can't really get the same sound. I mean, you might say you might prefer the sound of the triangle to the half sine wave. I mean, it's just a purely matter of preference. And actually, it's worth noting that there's no equivalent really to the triangle wave on the Mask1. But this half sine sound is great. I mean, I've not done any filtering on that. Okay, so starting off, there's obviously big differences in the sound. I've come as close as I can on the Prologue. Let's add some filtering. So on the Mask1, as well as the 12 dB per octave filter, you have other options. So as well as low pass, you've got high pass, band pass, notch, but you've also got a 24 dB per octave option for each of those. There's no 24 dB per octave option on the Prologue, but what I have seen mentioned is that the way that the drive engine on the Prologue works is it takes the output of the filter and feeds it back in. And so essentially by turning the drive up, the theory is that you are actually getting the effect of a 24 dB per octave filter, because it's kind of feeding it all the way back through, so you're getting 12 dB per octaves twice. So interestingly, by adding the drive to the Prologue, I think I have come a bit closer. Let's try and filter this sound on the Prologue. And we'll filter, I'm going to change the Mask1 filter to 24 dB per octave, because I think that is more like the effect we're getting out of the Prologue. And that's what I wanted to do. So the Mask1 is leading the way here and we're following on the Prologue. So let's reduce the filter. Somewhat similar. Let's turn the filter all the way down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the filter envelope. Now each of the envelopes on the noise sources and the filter in the Mask1 can loop, which is another advantage. It's somewhere that is something that the Prologue just can't do. But what I'm going to do is use the looping envelope on the filter, and then I'll try and match that using the LFO on the filter on the Prologue. So at the moment the filter is fully closed, you can't hear anything. Let's loop. So the speed of the looping envelope is determined by the attack and the decay portions of the envelope. So the attack and the decay portions of the envelope determine the LFO shape, essentially. Now you have got two LFOs as well you can use to do the same thing, but I quite like using the looping envelopes, because then that leaves me the LFOs to do other things. Okay, obviously on the Prologue, famously, we only have one LFO. Let's set it to cutoff, and let's set the intensity to maximum, and we'll set the wave shape to sawtooth. Now here I'm going to have to go into the menus. I've done a video on the LFOs in the Prologue just to go into this in some detail, so I'll put a link to it here. If you're interested in what I'm doing, please watch that video, because the LFOs, the LFO I should say, singular, although there's only one of them, it's quite flexible in terms of how it operates. You can use it almost as an envelope, which is what I am going to do here. Basically, I'm turning voice sync off, but key sync remains on. So that means now that's interesting. I've got the LFO on maximum intensity. And it's not opening the filter all the way. That's also interesting. Sorry, I'm just noticing this, that even with the filter cut off all the way open, the LFO is still having an impact on the cutoff frequency, which again to me suggests that even when the filter's fully open, well, the knob tells you it's fully open, you're still hearing filtered sounds. So that supports what I thought in the first part of the video, which is why the VCOs sound slightly muffled compared to the Mask1. That is actually quite a lovely sound. So that's the Mask1. So I want the release. Okay, that's an immediate difference. The LFO obviously continues even after I release the key, whereas the looping envelope stops. So that alone, that comparison is quite interesting. It's made me think, actually, I don't want to use the filter envelope. I am going to use one of the LFOs to do that, just because I want that effect on the Mask1 as well. So I'll reduce the speed a bit, but increase the amount. Obviously, I need to change the waveform to down ramp. Ha. Now here, we're experiencing one of the differences between the Mask1 and the Prologue. Even though there's only one LFO on the Prologue, as I've mentioned, it's quite flexible in terms of the way you use it. You can use it almost like you can have it as a global LFO, you can have it as a per voice LFO. On the Mask1, you do have some interesting options. So you have fade in and out on the LFOs, which is very useful, but they are always free running and you can't trigger them by key press. And they're always global. So I can't replicate that sound on the Mask1 using the LFO. So I go back to the looping envelope. So I need to turn off the LFO. Okay, so that's very interesting. So I think you'd have to score that in a way as a win for the Prologue, just from the flexibility of its LFO. I'm trying to think now, as I'm making this video, whether there is a way of getting the sound so that the looping envelope still rings out even in the release phase of the oscillators. I can't immediately think of a way of doing that. I was trying to work out if I have the filter fully open and then reverse the envelope, might that do it? I don't know. Let's just give that a whirl, just for interest's sake. So I'll fully open the filter and I'll reverse. Reverse the envelope. And the answer is no, that doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to chalk this up for, in terms of the way the filter cutoff modulation works, I think I'm going to chalk this up as a win for the Prologue, just because of the flexibility of its LFOs. Now, I have made the request to Kodamo to have key synced LFOs, which would solve that problem, but at the moment there's just no way of getting that sound on the Mask1. Having said that, if we take the filter out of it, I do prefer the sound of the half sign on the Mask1 to the Prologue. Triangle, I've mentioned on earlier videos, I'll mention it again, there is a fault with the Prologue. It's not just with my unit, it seems to affect all of them that I've heard about, where every so often when you play a triangle, instead of getting a clean triangle, sometimes you get a clean triangle like that. Other times you can hear the kind of distortion or some kind of artifact in the triangle sound. They just heard it there, which is a shame because when you want to play a triangle, you don't want that kind of sound to it. So that is the second. That's the second patch, second sound example. And it's slightly difficult because I'm having to constrain what I do on the Mask1 unnaturally because, as I say, there's just things the Mask1 can do that the Prologue can't do. So I'm trying to avoid getting too far into that area. Let's add some resonance to that. Yeah, I'm using the drive to try and get to a 24 dB per octave type effect on the filter, but as soon as you put the drive in, it affects the quality of the resonance. Makes it a lot more screechy and kind of in your face. Whereas the resonance sounds a lot smoother, obviously, on the Mask1. Okay, so that's the start of the sound on the Mask1, and I think the Prologue has an interesting take on it using the triangle waves. I really like the way that the LFO makes the filter cutoff effect continue in the release stage of the VCOs. I actually prefer the way that the resonance works on the Mask1 in this example. I don't like the way the resonance sounds there, whereas that's a lot nicer on the Mask1. So, okay, that's the genesis of a sound here, which I would probably save and work on more. So what would I do? I might add some vibrato, a very basic thing. Now, so LFO2 is set up, well, they're both set up to be vibrato by default. I've messed around with LFO1, so I'll just change LFO2. And there's a trick on the Prologue, although you've only got one LFO, you've got one of the chorus effects in the effects section. I'm not sure, that's just off the screen actually, so you can't see it unfortunately. But one of the chorus options for the effect is a vibrato. So people say you can't do chorus, you can't do vibrato and use the LFO for something else. That's not quite true, because you do have an effect that is vibrato. Okay, my camera stopped recording, so I didn't get to complete the sound design on camera. After the last bit that you saw there, I just spent a minute or two just adding effects to each of the sounds, tweaking the vibrato. They're very different sounds, obviously, and I think they probably give you an indication of the basic character difference between the two synths. The Prologue is more, it's kind of darker, more muffled sound. That's the filter working, which I think I've just established on this video for myself. The filter is always in the path and it's always cutting out some of the highs. The Mask1, it's a more high-end, in some ways it's a more high-end digital sound. In other ways you can hear kind of glitchiness in some of the oscillators. I think each of them has got their own specific sound. I'd say the Mask1 is a unique synthesizer in terms of what's available on the market at the moment. It has some limitations, very deliberately so in some cases, but it's a very powerful synth. It has its own character, and it's quite easy to come up with sounds like that, which I think I've shown you can't come up with sounds like that on the Mask1, which I think I've shown you can't easily replicate on other synthesizers. There is something unique there. At the same time, what the Prologue can do does sound lovely, even here using the triangle wave, which I don't like to use very often because of the issue I've mentioned with the distortion. I think that is a nice sound, and you know, once the LFO is limited in some ways, there's only one of them. It's got a very limited set of destinations, very limited set of wave shapes. But the way you can use it, so it's got key sync on, key sync off, one single global LFO or 16 separate LFOs essentially. you know, the Korg have managed to get quite a lot of power and variety out of what is really a very simple LFO. So hats off to them there. I think I've shown enough, hopefully, to give you an overview of the sound character of these two synths. I've very deliberately tried to limit myself as far as possible to just looking at how they sound. I've had to talk about the UI, the user interface, to a certain extent to explain some of the decisions I'm making when I'm coming up with sounds on these two different synthesizers. But again, if I was going to start talking about the build quality, the feel of the keyboard, etc., etc., I'd be here for hours. So if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate it. Please give me a like and a subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video. Goodbye for now.